Dolly Parton image must have at times been a little intimidating.
Not really. He knows how bad I can look.
I think Carl Dean's waiting for me on the other side. I have 2 boyfriends back home, thinking that's the last thing I'm going to meet up with a boy.
Is a boy.
I don't need a boy.
I mean, what?
Well, I got one that lasted 40 years. I said, I think that's a great idea because I've spent my whole life traveling on the roads.
Because he's too pretty, I'm afraid to let him out.
On August 25th, 2026, something happened that millions of people knew would eventually come, but somehow never felt prepared for. Dolly Parton died.
Sad breaking news. Country music legend Dolly Parton has died.
Dolly Parton has died.
Beloved American icon Dolly Parton has died.
She was 80 years old. Her family said she passed away peacefully in Nashville, Tennessee.
She never saw a door she couldn't open, and the doors she opened made and changed history. My family and I have shared a lifetime of beautiful memories with Dolly, but so have you. She has always been on your television, your record player, your CD, and on your phone playlist, becoming an extended part of your family whether you liked it or not. Our family and the team she has entrusted with her legacy will work diligently to ensure her spirit will live with us forever. Dolly was a farmer, just like her daddy. He farmed the soil, she farmed songs and happiness. Dolly called me and said she wants to rest in a beautiful bed of plush cotton because after a life wearing heavy rhinestones, she finally deserves to be comfortable and have some rest.
And almost immediately, something remarkable happened. Country singers mourned her, rock stars mourned her, actors, politicians, songwriters, people who had never bought a country record in their lives, people from completely different generations, different backgrounds, different beliefs, all seemed to understand something enormous had disappeared.
This Dolly Parton image must have at times been a little intimidating.
Not really. He knows how bad I can look.
Because Dolly Parton wasn't simply a country singer. Somehow, over the course of 8 decades, Dolly had become something much harder to achieve. Beloved.
We're best friends. We really are both very independent.
She wrote thousands of songs, sold more than 100 million records, won Grammys, became a movie star, built a business empire, created Dollywood, and wrote songs that became part of people's lives. Jolene, 9 to 5, Coat of Many Colors, and a little song called I Will Always Love You.
Married again, and we're going to get in our RV and go on a honeymoon.
But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Dolly Parton wasn't what she accumulated. It was what she gave away. Money, books, opportunities, help, hope. Millions of children received free books because Dolly remembered something from her own childhood. Her father had never learned to read or write.
We don't stay together long enough to make each other sick. We're always happy to see each other, and by the time I'm ready to go, he's ready for me to.
She helped communities devastated by disaster, supported medical research, helped families, and somehow, the bigger Dolly Parton became, the more determined she seemed not to forget where she'd come from. And maybe that's the key to understanding why the world loved her. Because before the rhinestones, before the enormous blonde hair, before Nashville, before Hollywood, before anybody knew the name Dolly Parton, there was a little girl standing on the porch of a tiny cabin in the mountains of Tennessee. She didn't have a microphone, so she made one from a tin can and a tobacco stick.
I love the old guy. He's the only one I've ever wanted and the only one I'll ever have.
Her family had very little money. Dolly was the 4th of 12 children. In fact, when Dolly was born, her father reportedly paid the doctor who delivered her with a bag of cornmeal. Think about that. One of the most successful entertainers America would ever produce entered the world in a tiny cabin to a family that couldn't pay the doctor with money. Yet that little girl looked out at those Tennessee mountains and imagined something enormous. She wanted to sing. She wanted to write. She wanted to perform. She wanted more.
I have a mic. I have one. Well, how's everybody doing today out in that hot boiling sun?
And Dolly Parton would eventually get more than that little girl could possibly have imagined. Money, fame, success, a career lasting nearly 6 decades. Her name in lights around the world. But Dolly never seemed embarrassed by the little girl she'd once been. She wrote about her, sang about her, built businesses in the mountains where she'd grown up, And when she became wealthy enough, she started giving other children opportunities her own family never had. Maybe that's why, when Dolly Parton died, it didn't feel like we'd simply lost the queen of country music. It felt strangely personal.
Anyway, I wanted to welcome all of you and say thank you for coming. We're very excited about our truck stop, the Tennessee and Travel Stop.
So how did a desperately poor little girl from Locust Ridge, Tennessee, become one of the most recognizable women on earth? How did she survive in the industry that frequently underestimated her? Why did she protect one extraordinary love story for almost 60 years? And after earning more money, receiving more awards, and achieving more success than she could ever have dreamed of, why did Dolly Parton spend so much of her life giving something back? To understand that, we have to remove the rhinestones, forget the enormous hair, and go back to the Smoky Mountains, to 12 children squeezed into a tiny home, and one little girl standing on a wooden porch, singing into a homemade microphone, as though somewhere beyond those mountains, the whole world was already listening.
Of course, he's had this place for a while, and he said, well, why don't we just go into business together? I said, I think that's a great idea, because I've spent my whole life traveling.
Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, in the mountains of East Tennessee. She was the fourth of 12 children. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, worked as a sharecropper and took construction jobs. Her mother, Avi Lee, looked after an enormous family with very little money. And the Partons were poor, not Hollywood's romantic version of poor. Poor. Their little mountain home had no electricity, no running water. There were 14 people trying to make a life together with almost nothing.
Anyway, I wanted to welcome all of you and to say thanks.
But when Dolly remembered that childhood later, something interesting happened. She didn't talk only about what they lacked. She remembered what they had: family, stories, faith, humor, and everywhere, music. Her mother sang old songs and ballads. Church brought gospel music. The mountains themselves were filled with the sounds that would eventually find their way into Dolly's songwriting.
And I'm sure some of you are wondering why I wanted a truck stop. Well, I couldn't leave it to beavers.
And Dolly started writing remarkably young. According to the Library of Congress timeline, she wrote her first song when she was about 5 years old. At 7, she fashioned an instrument from an old mandolin and bass strings. This wasn't a little girl waiting to discover what she wanted to become. Dolly seemed to know. She wanted to sing. She'd stand in front of whoever would listen and perform. Family, neighbors, church congregations, and eventually real audiences.
Don't you ever say I just walked away.
One person in particular recognized something in her. Her uncle, Bill Owens. Bill encouraged Dolly's songwriting, helped her with music, and began taking her to places where perhaps somebody might notice her.
For my life, I will always want you.
By the age of 10, Dolly was performing on the Cass Walker Show, a popular radio and television program in Knoxville. Think about the journey she'd already made. A little girl from a cabin in the mountains was suddenly appearing on television, and she wasn't finished. At the teen, Dolly traveled to Nashville and appeared at the Grand Ole Opry. And the person who introduced that nervous 13-year-old girl that night was Johnny Cash. Imagine being Dolly, 13 years old, standing inside one of the most important institutions in country music, looking at performers she'd heard on a battery-powered radio back home. And suddenly, she was one of the people on the stage. For some children, that might have been enough. A wonderful memory, something to tell people about years later. For Dolly, it was confirmation. This was where she belonged. But Nashville didn't immediately throw open its doors. Dolly recorded songs as a teenager. Some went nowhere. She and Uncle Bill secured opportunities and lost them. Records failed to chart. Doors opened, then closed again. And still, Dolly kept writing. That's important. Because before the world understood Dolly Parton, the performer, Dolly was already becoming something arguably even more important. A songwriter. She could take ordinary life, poverty, family, heartbreak, jealousy, faith, women trying to survive, and turned those experiences into stories people recognize themselves inside. And much of that ability came directly from where she'd grown up. One of the greatest examples would arrive years later. Dolly's mother once made her daughter a coat from pieces of brightly colored fabric. To Dolly, it was beautiful, but when she wore it to school, other children laughed. They saw poverty. Dolly saw love. Years later, she turned that childhood memory into a coat of many colors. And perhaps that's one of the secrets to understanding Dolly Parton. She possessed an extraordinary ability to take something that could have made her ashamed and turn it into something she was proud of. She never pretended she hadn't been poor. She wrote songs about it. She talked about it. She recreated her childhood cabin at Dollywood. She made the place the world might have expected her to escape from. Part of the reason the world fell in love with her. But before any of that could happen, Dolly had to leave it. In 1964, she graduated from Sevier County High School. She became the first member of her family to graduate, and almost immediately, Dolly packed her belongings into a cardboard suitcase and headed for Nashville. She was 18 years old. No fortune, no famous family name, no guarantee that anybody in Nashville cared how badly Dolly Parton wanted this. But she had songs, she had ambition, and she had spent virtually her entire childhood preparing for this moment. The mountains disappeared behind her. Nashville appeared ahead, and somewhere between the two, the little girl singing into homemade microphones made a decision. She wasn't going home until the world knew her name. And then, on her very first day in Nashville, Dolly walked into a laundromat and met a young man named Carl Dean. She had come to Nashville looking for a career. Instead, before the career had even truly begun, Dolly Parton had just met the man who would quietly remain beside her for almost 60 years. Dolly Parton arrived in Nashville with a cardboard suitcase, a head full of songs, and absolutely no guarantee that any of this was going to work. She was 18 years old. She had just graduated from high school. And while other teenagers were trying to work out what they wanted to do with their lives, Dolly already knew she was going to be a star. But something happened almost immediately that had nothing to do with music. On her first day in Nashville, Dolly was outside the wishy-washy laundromat when a young man noticed her. His name was Carl Dean. Carl was 21. Dolly was 18. And according to Dolly, one of the things that immediately surprised her was where Carl looked when he spoke to her. At her face, not her body, not the image. Her. He seemed genuinely interested in finding out who this young woman was. And Carl Dean was almost a complete opposite of the life Dolly was about to create. Dolly wanted stages. Carl wanted privacy. Dolly would eventually become one of the most photographed women in America. Carl wanted almost nothing to do with celebrity. And somehow, it worked. 2 years after meeting, on May 30th, 1966, Dolly and Carl quietly drove to Ringgold, Georgia, and got married. There was no celebrity wedding, no magazine deal, no enormous crowd. Dolly's mother was there, the preacher's wife, and Dolly and Carl. That was essentially it. And while Dolly was building one of the most public lives imaginable, Carl would remain almost completely outside it. That wasn't an accident. It was the arrangement that seemed to protect something Dolly valued enormously, a life that didn't belong to the audience. But in 1966, the audience wasn't exactly chasing Dolly yet, because Nashville was proving harder to conquer than she'd imagined. She wrote songs, she knocked on doors, she recorded, she waited, and gradually, people began noticing something. Dolly Parton might have looked like someone the industry could package, but underneath the blonde hair was a songwriter with something to say. She and her Uncle Bill Owens wrote songs that other performers began recording. Their Put It Off Until Tomorrow became a top 10 country hit for Bill Phillips, and Dolly's songwriting credentials began growing. Then, in 1967, Dolly finally began breaking through as a performer herself. Dumb Blonde. The title almost sounds ironic now, because Dolly Parton would spend much of her career allowing people to underestimate her, while quietly being smarter than many of the people doing the underestimating. The song reached the country charts. Then came Something Fishy, and Dolly released her first full album, Hello, I'm Dolly. That title couldn't have been more appropriate because America was about to meet her. Then the telephone rang. Country star Porter Wagoner needed a new female singer for his hugely popular syndicated television program. Dolly got the job, and on September 5th, 1967, she appeared on The Porter Wagoner Show. For Dolly, this was enormous. Porter's program reached millions of viewers. Suddenly, the little girl from Locust Ridge was appearing regularly inside homes across America. But there was a problem. Some of Porter's audience didn't want Dolly. They had loved his previous singing partner, Norma Jean. And when this tiny blonde newcomer appeared, some audience members reportedly called for Norma Jean instead. Imagine that. Dolly had dreamed about getting an opportunity like this for years. She finally gets it, walks onto the stage, and discovers the audience wishes she were somebody else. But Dolly kept showing up, kept singing, kept smiling, and gradually the audience stopped asking for the woman who had been there before. They started asking for Dolly. Porter and Dolly became an enormously successful partnership. They recorded together, toured together, appeared on television together. Their first duet, The Last Thing on My Mind, reached the country top 10. More hits followed. Over the years, they would become one of country music's most recognizable duos. And Porter did something else that mattered enormously. He helped Dolly secure a contract with RCA. In fact, Dolly later said Porter was so convinced of her potential that he guaranteed RCA he would personally cover their losses if signing her didn't work. He never had to pay them anything because Dolly Parton was beginning to happen. But something else was happening too. Dolly wasn't content simply being Porter Wagoner's singing partner. She had her own stories, her own songs, her own ambitions, and some of those songs were remarkably bold. In 1968, she released Just Because I'm a Woman. The song confronted a sexual double standard, a man judging a woman for behavior he himself had been guilty of, and Dolly essentially asked, why should the rules be different for me? In late 1960s country music, that wasn't exactly a timid subject. Dolly could look sweet, sound sweet, smile sweetly, and then write something with teeth. That combination would become one of her greatest strengths, because people sometimes looked at Dolly Parton and saw the hair, the clothes, the figure, the jokes, but Dolly knew exactly what she was doing. She understood image, she understood business, and most importantly, she understood songs. By 1971, Dolly finally achieved something she'd been chasing for years. Her first solo #1 country single, Joshua. Now, the balance was beginning to change. Dolly wasn't simply the young woman standing beside Porter Wagoner anymore. Her own star was rising, and with success came confidence. More records, more audiences, more attention, more evidence that Dolly Parton could stand entirely on her own. Then came a song built from one of the simplest memories of her childhood. A coat made from scraps, a little girl being laughed at, and a mother's love turning poverty into something beautiful. Coat of many colors. Dolly wasn't running away from Locust Ridge. She was carrying it onto the radio with her, and people responded because Dolly's songs didn't sound like someone trying to manufacture emotion. They sounded lived. But then Dolly wrote another song. This one wasn't about childhood. It wasn't about poverty. And it wasn't about Porter Wagoner. It was about another woman, a beautiful red-haired woman who Dolly believed was paying just a little too much attention to Carl Dean. And instead of confronting her or attacking her, Dolly did what Dolly Parton did best. She wrote a song. Her name was Jolene. And that song was about to change everything. Because Dolly Parton was no longer simply becoming a successful country singer. She was becoming Dolly Parton. And soon, even Porter Wagoner would discover that the young woman he'd helped introduce to America had become too big to remain standing beside him. By the early 1970s, Dolly Parton was no longer simply the young woman standing beside Porter Wagoner. People knew her name, they knew her voice, and increasingly, they knew her songs. But Dolly was approaching a crossroads because the partnership that had helped build her career was beginning to feel like the thing preventing her from discovering how far she could go alone. And then came Jolene. The inspiration behind the name was surprisingly innocent. Dolly later explained that after performance, a young fan came up to her asking for an autograph. The little girl had beautiful red hair and told Dolly her name was Jolene. Dolly loved it. She remembered the name and began singing it to herself. Jolene, 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 Jolene. But the story inside the song came from somewhere else. There was a woman, a bank teller, who Dolly believed had taken a little too much interest in her husband, Carl, and Dolly noticed she could have written an angry song, a revenge song, a song attacking the other woman. Instead, Dolly did something far more interesting. She made herself vulnerable. The woman singing Jolene isn't threatening anybody. She's pleading. She's looking at another woman who she believes is more beautiful and admitting, I'm frightened you could take the person I love. That's what makes the song so human. This larger-than-life woman, who would eventually appear almost impossibly confident, wrote one of her greatest songs about insecurity. Released in 1973, Jolene became a #1 country hit and eventually one of the most recognizable songs Dolly Parton ever wrote. But while Dolly was writing about the possibility of losing Carl, another relationship in her life was already beginning to end. Her professional partnership with Porter Wagoner. Dolly had spent years beside Porter. She respected him. She appreciated what he'd done for her. She loved him, but she also knew it was time to leave. Porter didn't want her to go. Their relationship became increasingly difficult. Arguments followed. Emotions ran high. Dolly tried explaining that she needed her own career, but sometimes words spoken during an argument don't reach somebody. So Dolly decided to communicate in the language she understood better than almost anyone. She wrote a song. Dolly walked into Porter's office and told him she wanted him to listen. Then she began singing, If I Should Stay, and Porter listened. The song wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't revenge. It was gratitude, affection, and goodbye. Dolly was telling the man who had helped change her life that she loved him enough to leave without destroying what they'd meant to each other. The song was I Will Always Love You. Dolly later recalled that when she finished, Porter was crying, and eventually he agreed to let her go on the condition that he could produce the record. In 1974, Dolly's recording of I Will Always Love You reached #1 on the country chart. The same year, Jolene had done the same. Think about that. 2 songs, written by the same woman, within the same extraordinary creative period. One about desperately wanting someone to stay, the other about knowing you have to leave, and both would become part of music history. Dolly Parton had finally stepped away from Porter Wagoner. She was on her own, and almost immediately, another enormous opportunity appeared. This time, it involved Elvis Presley. Elvis wanted to record I Will Always Love You for a young songwriter. This should have been the phone call of a lifetime. Elvis Presley wanted your song. Imagine what that could mean. Exposure, prestige, money. Dolly was thrilled. Then, the night before the recording session, Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, explained the arrangement. If Elvis recorded the song, they wanted half of the publishing rights. And Dolly said no. That decision wasn't easy. She later remembered crying because she desperately wanted to hear Elvis sing her song. But Dolly understood something that would define her career. The song belonged to her. Publishing wasn't simply a check today. It was ownership tomorrow. So Dolly walked away from Elvis Presley. Think about the confidence that required. This was Dolly Parton, still establishing herself independently, saying no to one of the biggest entertainers who had ever lived. Not because she didn't admire Elvis. She did, but because Dolly understood the value of what she created. And nearly 20 years later, the world discovered just how valuable that decision had been. In 1992, Whitney Houston recorded I Will Always Love You for The Bodyguard. Her version became a global phenomenon, one of the biggest selling singles of all time. That enormous opening vocal became instantly recognizable. Millions of people who had never heard Dolly's original fell in love with the song, and somewhere Dolly Parton still owned it. Years earlier, she had cried because she'd been forced to tell Elvis Presley no. Now, that decision looked extraordinary, and this is where the stereotype of Dolly Parton starts falling apart, because it was easy to look at Dolly and see the hair, the rhinestones, the exaggerated femininity, the jokes, the accent, and assume she was somehow naive. Dolly knew people did that, and instead of fighting it, sometimes she seemed to enjoy it, because while people were busy underestimating Dolly Parton was owning the publishing. She understood songwriting. She understood contracts. She understood branding. She understood that fame could disappear, but ownership could continue paying you long after the applause stopped. That business instinct would eventually help Dolly build something much larger than a music career. But first, she had another problem. Country music had made Dolly Parton famous. Now, Dolly wanted the rest of the world. She wanted pop audiences, television, movies, Hollywood. And once again, people wondered whether she was reaching too far. But by now, Dolly had learned something. The world might tell her where she belonged. Men in the music industry might tell her how big she was allowed to become. People might laugh at the clothes, the hair, the ambition. But Dolly Parton had stopped waiting for permission. The little girl from Locust Ridge had left the mountains. The young singer had left Porter Wagoner. She had even told Elvis Presley no, and now Dolly was about to make the biggest gamble of her career. She wasn't going to remain just a country star. She was going to become a superstar. Asterisk, asterisk. Dolly Parton had conquered country music, but Dolly wasn't finished. By the late 1970s, she wanted something bigger, not because she was ashamed of country music. Quite the opposite. Dolly loved where she came from, but she didn't believe where you came from should determine how far you were allowed to go. She wanted pop radio, television, Hollywood, audiences who had never listened to a country station in their lives. And once again, there were people who wondered whether Dolly Parton was making a mistake, because Nashville understood Dolly. But with everybody else, Dolly's answer was essentially, let's find out. In 1977, she released an album called Here You Come Again. The title track crossed over from the country charts into mainstream pop. The album sold more than 1 million copies, and Dolly won the Grammy for Best Female Country Vocal Performance. Suddenly, Dolly Parton wasn't simply a country star anymore. America knew Dolly, and as her audience expanded, so did the image. The hair became bigger. The clothes became brighter. The rhinestones sparkled harder. Dolly understood something. Many performers spend entire careers trying to learn. If people were going to look at her, she was going to give them something to look at. And Dolly was wonderfully self-aware about all of it. She joked about her appearance, joked about the wigs, joked about cosmetic surgery, joked about the fact that creating Dolly Parton took some work. But underneath the humor was something extremely clever. Dolly had created one of the most recognizable personal brands in entertainment. You can see a silhouette, blonde hair, rhinestones, and instantly know Dolly. But the image also became a distraction, because while people laughed at Dolly's jokes, she was making decisions, writing songs, negotiating, building ownership, and gradually turning Dolly Parton into something bigger than a recording artist. Then Hollywood called. In 1980, Dolly appeared in her first feature film, alongside Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin. The movie was 9 to 5, and once again, people had reason to underestimate her. Dolly had never acted in a major movie before, so she did something that tells you almost everything about how seriously she approached her work. She reportedly memorized not only her own dialogue, but practically the entire screenplay, because Dolly believed that's what actors did. She arrived prepared for everything, and somehow the woman making her movie debut looked completely comfortable standing beside 2 established Hollywood stars. But Dolly wasn't simply acting in the film. She also wrote its theme song, and according to Dolly, the idea came from her fingernails. She would click her acrylic nails together, creating a rhythm that reminded her of a typewriter. Click, click, click. And from something that simple came 9 to 5, the song exploded. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became one of Dolly's defining recordings. She earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song and won Grammys for it. Dolly Parton had arrived in Hollywood, and she hadn't needed to stop being Dolly to do it. More movies followed. The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, Rhinestone, Steel Magnolias. Dolly could walk into a completely different industry, surrounded by established movie stars. And somehow, the same thing kept happening. People liked her, maybe because Dolly never appeared to be trying desperately to prove how important she was. She could make herself the punchline. She could laugh at the hair before somebody else did. She could tell jokes about her body, her clothes, her background, and then quietly demonstrate that underneath the jokes was somebody extremely difficult to underestimate twice. And Dolly's ambitions were still growing because she understood that performers don't always control what happens to their careers. Songs stop charting, television changes, Hollywood moves on, audiences find somebody new. But Dolly had spent too much of her childhood with nothing to leave her future entirely in somebody else's hands. So she began building businesses, production interests, publishing, investments, and eventually Dolly looked back toward the mountains she had left behind. East Tennessee was still home, and while Dolly's success had taken her around the world, many people in the region didn't have the same opportunities. Jobs mattered, tourism mattered, families needed reasons to remain in the area. So in the mid-1980s, Dolly became involved with a small Tennessee theme park called Silver Dollar City. She didn't simply lend them her name, she became a partner. And in 1986, the park reopened with a new identity, Dollywood. Some people probably saw a celebrity theme park. Dolly saw something else, an opportunity to bring visitors and jobs back to the mountains that had given her everything. Dollywood became one of Tennessee's biggest tourist attractions. Hotels followed, entertainment ventures, businesses, thousands of jobs, connected to an empire bearing the name of a woman who had once grown up without electricity. Think about that journey. The little girl standing outside a tiny cabin, imagining another life, had become wealthy enough to build something enormous, almost within sight of where she'd begun. But Dolly didn't bulldoze her past. She celebrated it. The mountains, the music, the crafts, the stories, even a recreation of her childhood home. It was almost as though Dolly had spent decades traveling farther and farther from Locust Ridge, only to discover that the place she'd been trying to reach was somehow connected to where she'd started. And by now, Dolly Parton had achieved almost everything. Country star, pop star, movie star, songwriter, businesswoman, cultural icon. She had money beyond anything her childhood family could have imagined. But then, something interesting happened, because Dolly could have taken all that success and simply enjoyed it. Instead, she began asking what she could do with it, and the answer would eventually involve millions of children receiving something Dolly's own father had never been able to fully experience. A book, not one book, not 1,000, not even 1,000,000. Eventually, Dolly Parton would give away hundreds of millions of them. And suddenly, the words on our thumbnail start meaning something much bigger, because Dolly had spent decades building an extraordinary life. Now, she was going to spend the rest of it giving pieces of that success away. By the 1990s, Dolly Parton had more money than the little girl from Locust Ridge could ever have imagined. She had homes, businesses, awards, a theme park, a catalog of songs, worth a fortune. She spent decades building a life far beyond the poverty she had been born into. But Dolly remembered something. Her father couldn't read or write. Robert Lee Parton was one of the smartest people Dolly knew. She described him as street smart, a hardworking man who could make deals, provide for 12 children, and survive when survival wasn't easy. But he'd never had the opportunity to receive a proper education, and Dolly knew that bothered him. So she began thinking about children, not celebrity children, not children in Hollywood, children back home in Sevier County, Tennessee, children growing up in the same mountains where Dolly had once stood with dreams bigger than her circumstances. And in 1995, Dolly Parton launched the Imagination Library. The idea was beautifully simple. Every month, a child enrolled in the program would receive a book delivered directly to their home from birth until they began school. It didn't matter how much money their parents had. It didn't matter whether the family could afford a bookshelf full of stories. The books would simply arrive. And Dolly dedicated the program to her father. At first, it was local, just Dolly trying to do something good for children in the place where she'd grown up. But then other communities noticed. They wanted it too. The program expanded across Tennessee, then across America, then beyond America, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Ireland, and eventually children around the world were opening their mailboxes and finding a book from Dolly. By 2026, Dolly Parton's Imagination Library was mailing millions of books every month to children around the world. Think about that. A program inspired by a man who couldn't read had grown into something helping millions of children learn to, and perhaps the sweetest part was what Dolly said about her father. Of all the things she had accomplished, the records, the awards, the movies, Dollywood, her father was particularly proud of the Imagination Library. Dolly recalled that he called it the Imagination Library, not Dolly's program, not his famous daughter's charity, something that had become important in its own right. And Dolly loved that because underneath everything, the enormous success, the extraordinary fame, she was still Robert Lee Parton's daughter. But the books were only one part of what Dolly gave. In 2016, wildfires devastated parts of the Great Smoky Mountains, including communities around Gatlinburg and Sevier County. Homes were destroyed. Families lost everything. And Dolly's response was immediate. She created the My People Fund. That name matters. Not the victims, not those people. My people, families who had lost their homes, received direct financial assistance while trying to rebuild their lives. The fund ultimately distributed millions of dollars to families affected by the fires. Again, Dolly hadn't forgotten. The mountains weren't simply the place she marketed as part of her image. They were home. And when home hurt, Dolly showed up. Then came 2020. COVID-19 spread around the world. Hospitals filled. Families were frightened. Scientists raced to develop vaccines that could save lives. And among the donors supporting research at Vanderbilt University Medical Center was Dolly Parton. She donated $1 million toward coronavirus research. That funding helped support work connected to development of the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. And Dolly, being Dolly, even managed to turn vaccination into a moment of humor. When she received her own shot, she adapted the melody of Jolene, encouraging others to get vaccinated. Only Dolly Parton could make a medical appointment feel like a performance, but underneath the joke was something consistent. Dolly had spent years using the thing people gave her attention to direct attention somewhere else. Children's literacy, disaster relief, healthcare, education, communities, people who needed help. And she didn't always announce everything she did. There are stories throughout Dolly's life of assistance given privately, scholarships, donations, families helped, causes supported. Sometimes people discovered Dolly had contributed only afterward, because philanthropy wasn't another character Dolly had created. It seemed connected to something much older, something that began inside that crowded cabin. When you've grown up sharing everything, food, beds, clothes, space, maybe success doesn't feel like something you're supposed to keep entirely for yourself. And Dolly never pretended money wasn't important. She knew exactly what poverty felt like. She'd worked enormously hard to escape it. She built businesses, protected her publishing, made smart investments. She enjoyed beautiful things, beautiful clothes, beautiful homes, and yes, a lot of rhinestones. But Dolly understood that money could do more than by things. It could change somebody's circumstances. And there was another reason Dolly's generosity mattered. She and Carl never had children. Dolly spoke about that many times over the years. There had been moments when she imagined what motherhood might have looked like, what their children might have been like. But life went another way. And eventually, Dolly began looking at it differently. Perhaps, she said, if she'd had children of her own, she wouldn't have been able to do everything else she had done. Maybe she wouldn't have traveled the same way, worked the same way, built the same things, helped the same number of people. And Dolly sometimes referred to the children reached through her work as though in some way they had become hers too. There's something beautiful about that. The woman who never became a mother herself ended up sending bedtime stories into millions of children's homes. The girl whose family had almost nothing created opportunities for families she'd never meet. The daughter of a man who couldn't read put hundreds of millions of books into children's hands. And maybe this is where we finally understand why Dolly Parton became more than famous. Fame makes people know your name. Talent makes people admire you. Success makes people respect what you've achieved. But none of those things automatically make people love you. Dolly seemed to understand that the greatest thing she could do with success wasn't simply to have more. It was to make success useful. And she kept doing it year after year after year until something happened that Dolly could never fix. With money, couldn't write away with a song, couldn't solve with another project. The man she'd met outside that laundromat on her very first day in Nashville, the man who had quietly watched almost the entire extraordinary journey from the sidelines, began reaching the end of his own. Carl Dean, for nearly 60 years, while the world had Dolly Parton, Carl had simply Dolly. And in 2025, she had to say goodbye to the man who had been there almost from the beginning. For perhaps the first time in Dolly Parton's extraordinary life, there was something she couldn't give enough to keep, asterisk, asterisk. For almost 60 years, there were really two versions of Dolly Parton's life. There was a life the world saw, the stages, the cameras, the rhinestones, the movies, the interviews, the enormous blonde hair. And then there was the life that belonged to Dolly and Carl. Carl Dean had met Dolly on her very first day in Nashville, before the #1 records, before Porter Wagoner, before Jolene, before Hollywood, before Dollywood, before practically everything that would eventually make Dolly Parton, Dolly Parton. And somehow, through all of it, Carl stayed almost completely out of the spotlight. He wasn't interested in becoming Mr. Dolly Parton. He didn't want interviews, didn't want red carpets, didn't want photographers following him around. And famously, he didn't particularly enjoy attending entertainment industry events. Dolly once recalled taking Carl to an award ceremony early in their marriage. He dressed up, went with her, sat through the evening, and afterward essentially told Dolly, "Don't ever ask me to do that again." And she didn't. It became part of their arrangement. Dolly could belong to the world, but when she came home, Carl didn't need the superstar. He just needed his wife. Maybe that's one reason their marriage survived, something that destroys so many celebrity relationships. Carl wasn't competing with Dolly's fame. He didn't need a piece of it, and Dolly didn't force him to become part of her public image. She protected his privacy, sometimes so successfully that people actually wondered whether Carl Dean was real. Dolly found that hilarious, because while millions of people felt as though they knew Dolly, the person who perhaps knew her best was somebody most of them wouldn't have recognized walking down the street. Carl ran an asphalt paving business. He lived quietly. He stayed home. He loved cars. He read. He went about his life, while his wife became one of the most recognizable women on earth. And perhaps that gave Dolly something fame couldn't: normality. Because imagine what Dolly's life became. Walk into a restaurant, people stare. Walk through an airport, people recognize you. Go shopping, People want photographs. Everywhere Dolly Parton went, she was Dolly Parton. But behind closed doors, with Carl, she could simply be Dolly. They had their own humor, their own routines, their own arguments, their own private language, built across decades of living together. And Dolly was always careful not to pretend their marriage was some perfect fairy tale. They disagreed. They annoyed each other. They spent enormous amounts of time apart because Dolly's career required it. But somehow they found a rhythm that worked for them, perhaps because they weren't trying to make their marriage look perfect to everybody else. They were simply trying to make it work for each other. And Carl even managed to become part of Dolly's songwriting mythology. Remember Jolene, that desperate plea to another woman not to take her man. The woman who inspired the jealousy behind that song was reportedly a bank teller who Dolly thought was paying Carl just a little too much attention. Carl apparently enjoyed the attention Dolly noticed, and the world got one of the greatest country songs ever written, which means, in a strange way, even Carl Dean's trip to the bank became part of music history. But underneath the jokes, there was genuine devotion. Dolly repeatedly described Carl as the love of her life, and despite decades of tabloid rumors and endless speculation, their marriage endured 50 years, then 55, then nearly 60. In 2016, Dolly and Carl renewed their wedding vows to celebrate their 50th anniversary. The first wedding had been tiny because Dolly's career was just beginning and her record label hadn't wanted her making a public spectacle of getting married. 50 years later, Dolly finally got the wedding experience she'd wanted. She dressed beautifully. Carl dressed up. They renewed their vows. And then, in typical Dolly fashion, she used the occasion to help raise money for charity, because apparently, even Dolly Parton's romantic anniversary could somehow end up helping somebody else. But time was moving. Dolly and Carl were getting older, and increasingly, Dolly began spending more time close to home. Then, on March 3rd, 2025, Dolly announced that Carl Dean had died. He was 82 years old. After nearly 60 years of marriage, Carl was gone, and Dolly's announcement was simple. She thanked people for their prayers and sympathy, and she said something that perhaps summed up their entire relationship. Carl and Dolly had spent many wonderful years together. There was no enormous public performance of grief, no attempt to turn Carl's death into entertainment. Just Dolly saying goodbye to the man who had been there before almost anybody else. And then Dolly did what Dolly Parton had always done when something became too difficult to explain. She wrote. Only days after Carl's death, Dolly released If You Hadn't Been There, a song for him. She wrote about the man who had stood beside her, supported her, and helped make her extraordinary life possible. Nearly 60 years earlier, Dolly had written I Will Always Love You to say goodbye to Porter Wagoner. Now, in her late 70s, she was using music to say goodbye to Carl. But this goodbye was different. Porter had remained somewhere in the world. Carl wasn't coming back, and grief began changing Dolly's life. She later acknowledged that while caring for Carl, she had put some of her own health issues to one side. That's something many caregivers understand. When somebody you love needs you, your own problems can begin feeling less important. You tell yourself you'll deal with them later. You'll make the appointment later. You'll rest later. You'll take care of yourself later. But eventually, later arrives. And after Carl was gone, Dolly had to confront her own health. In 2025, she postponed some appearances. She stepped back from certain commitments. Her sister even caused a wave of concern after publicly asking people to pray for Dolly before later clarifying that she hadn't meant to frighten anyone. Dolly herself responded with humor because, of course, She did. She reassured people that she wasn't ready to disappear. There was still work to do, still projects, still songs, still plans. But something had undeniably changed. For nearly 60 years, Dolly Parton had known that somewhere away from the cameras, away from the crowds, away from the world, Carl Dean was there. Now, for the first time since she was 18 years old, he wasn't. And perhaps there is something especially poignant about the final period of Dolly's life, because she had spent decades giving pieces of herself to millions of people, songs, books, money, laughter, opportunities, hope. But the person who had quietly shared almost the entire journey had gone ahead without her, and Dolly kept going. She worked, she wrote, she talked about the future, even as health problems forced her to slow down, even as grief followed her through the house. She had once shared with Carl, Dolly Parton had always been extraordinarily good at saying goodbye in songs. But this time, there wasn't another verse that could bring him back. And just 17 months after Carl Dean died, Dolly would follow him. But here's the part that makes her final days so unmistakably Dolly, because only days before her own death, she wasn't talking as though the story was over. She was still making plans, still working, still looking toward tomorrow. At 80 years old, after poverty, fame, heartbreak, 6 decades of music, and nearly 60 years with the same man, Dolly Parton still believed there was more to give, asterisk, asterisk. For most people, 80 years would feel like a full life. For Dolly Parton, apparently, it still wasn't enough. Because even after decades of recording, thousands of songs, movies, businesses, Dollywood, hundreds of millions of books, and almost every honor an entertainer could receive, Dolly still had ideas. There were still projects she wanted to finish, still things she wanted to build, still dreams she hadn't managed to turn into reality. But during the final year of Dolly's life, something had changed. Her health was forcing her to slow down. After Carl died, Dolly acknowledged that while caring for him, she had neglected some of her own health problems. She'd been concentrating on the man she'd loved for almost 60 years. And perhaps, like so many caregivers, Dolly had told herself, "I'll deal with me later." But later eventually arrived. There had been kidney stone infections, complications, medical procedures, periods of dizziness and dehydration. Appearances had to be canceled. A planned Las Vegas residency was postponed and eventually canceled. For someone who had spent almost her entire life working, that couldn't have been easy, because Dolly Parton didn't really seem to understand retirement. She understood work, writing, creating, planning, dreaming, even when her body was beginning to demand something different. And Dolly tried to reassure everyone she was receiving treatment. She was taking care of herself. She wasn't ready to disappear. In June 2026, Dolly made what would become her final public appearance. And wonderfully, it wasn't at some enormous award ceremony. It wasn't the Grand Ole Opry. It wasn't a glamorous Hollywood event. It was a truck stop, a Tennessee truck stop bearing Dolly's name. And somehow that feels perfect. The woman who had traveled countless miles during a lifetime on the road turned up to celebrate another business back home in Tennessee, still smiling, still Dolly, still building things. Then came August 2026. Dolly had been expected at Dollywood for the opening of a new attraction, but doctors advised her not to travel. So Dolly appeared by video instead. Even when she couldn't physically be there, she found a way to show up. And behind the scenes, there were still more plans. A major museum devoted to her life, a new hotel in downtown Nashville, new business ventures, creative projects. Dolly wasn't organizing the closing chapter of her life. She was still building the next one. And then, on August 21st, just 4 days before her death, Dolly Parton gave what would become one of her final interviews. She acknowledged that things had been difficult. She talked openly about the health problems she'd been dealing with, about having neglected some of those issues while caring for Carl. But then Dolly did something that makes the interview almost heartbreaking to read now. She started talking about the future. She said she was still healing, but she was also still working. And then Dolly explained that she still had so many things she wanted to achieve. For days, that's all that separated those words from her death. But Dolly couldn't have known that. She was talking like someone who believed there would be another month, another year, another project, another ridiculous idea she could somehow turn into something real. She even talked about technology, avatar performances that might allow a version of Dolly to keep appearing even when touring had become too difficult. And naturally, she made a joke about still getting paid without having to show up, because even while discussing age, health, and limitations, Dolly Parton was still Dolly Parton. Funny, practical, ambitious, and apparently incapable of imagining herself without another project. Then, August 25th arrived. Dolly Parton died peacefully in Nashville. She was 80 years old. Her family and representatives announced her death. At the time this documentary is being made, no official cause of death has been publicly disclosed. And I think we need to leave it there, because unless Dolly's family or the appropriate authorities tell us more, anything beyond that is speculation, and reducing an 80-year life to an unanswered question about its final hours would somehow miss the entire point, because Dolly Parton's final days tell us something far more interesting than speculation ever could. She wasn't finished. This woman, who had already accomplished more than most people could fit into several lifetimes, still believed there was more she could do, more to create, more to build, more to give. And maybe that tells us something about the little girl we met at the beginning of this story. The girl standing on a porch in the Tennessee mountains, singing into a homemade microphone. She had dreamed herself out of poverty, dreamed herself to Nashville, dreamed herself onto television, onto records, into Hollywood, into business, into millions of homes. And apparently, even at 80, she hadn't stopped dreaming. But on August 25th, the work finally stopped. The woman who seemed to have an endless supply of songs, jokes, ideas, and plans was gone. And suddenly, the world began looking backward at the music, the movies, the photographs, the rhinestones, the enormous hair, the jokes, the generosity, the little girl from Locust Ridge who somehow became one of the most famous women on earth. And perhaps only then did the scale of what Dolly Parton had given us become completely clear, because the final question isn't really how did Dolly Parton die? The answer we should be looking for is much bigger. Why did the world love her so much? Asterisk, asterisk. And to answer that, we need to go back one final time, not to her death, but to everything she left behind. Go back to the beginning, before Nashville, before Hollywood, before Dollywood, before the Grammys, the movies, the rhinestones, and that enormous blonde hair. There was a little girl standing outside a tiny cabin in the mountains of Tennessee. Her family didn't have much. There were 12 children, 14 people sharing a small home, no electricity, no running water, and a father who had never learned to read or write. But Dolly Parton had something, imagination. She could look beyond those mountains and see a life that didn't exist yet. She imagined stages, songs, audiences, a world far beyond Locust Ridge. And somehow she reached it. Dolly left those mountains with a cardboard suitcase and headed for Nashville. She met Carl Dean on her first day there. She knocked on doors, wrote songs, was rejected, kept writing. Then Porter Wagoner gave her an opportunity. And when the time came, Dolly found the courage to leave him too, not with anger, not with revenge, but with a song, I Will Always Love You. Then there was Jolene, Coat of Many Colors, 9 to 5, songs that didn't simply become hits. They became part of people's lives. And when Elvis Presley wanted one of Dolly's greatest songs, but the deal meant surrendering half the publishing, Dolly Parton said no, because underneath the jokes, the accent, the hair, and the carefully exaggerated image was an extraordinarily smart woman. Dolly understood something people underestimated at their peril. She knew exactly who she was, and maybe that's part of why people loved her. Dolly never seemed embarrassed by where she'd come from. She didn't erase the poor little girl from the mountains when she became rich. She introduced her to the world. She sang about the homemade clothes, the family, the poverty, the mountains, her mother, her father. The things somebody else might have hidden became the things Dolly celebrated. And when she finally had more money than that little girl could ever have imagined, Dolly did something that tells us perhaps more about her than any #1 record ever could. She remembered what it was like to have very little. She remembered the communities that raised her. She remembered her father's inability to read. And then she did something about it. A program that began by giving books to children back home in Tennessee eventually placed hundreds of millions of books into the hands of children around the world. A daughter whose father couldn't read helped millions of children learn how. Maybe that's Dolly Parton's greatest song, not something she recorded, something she created, and Dolly kept giving. When wildfires devastated her Tennessee community, she helped families rebuild. When scientists were fighting COVID, Dolly gave money to medical research. When people needed jobs back home, she built businesses that brought opportunity to the mountains. And sometimes she helped people without making sure everybody knew about it, because despite the enormous image, Dolly Parton apparently understood that generosity doesn't need a spotlight. Then there was Carl, the man who had met Dolly before the world did. For almost 60 years, while millions of people shared a little piece of Dolly Parton, Carl Dean had something different. He had Dolly, not the performer, not the icon, his wife. And perhaps that relationship gave Dolly somewhere she didn't have to perform. Somewhere the hair, the clothes, the fame didn't matter. When Carl died in 2025, Dolly lost the person who had quietly traveled beside her through almost the entire journey. And still, she kept going, still working, still creating, still imagining what she might do next. Even 4 days before her own death, Dolly was talking about the future. That detail may tell us more about Dolly Parton than almost anything else. At 80 years old, after accomplishing almost everything she had once dreamed about, she still wasn't done dreaming. And then, on August 25th, 2026, Dolly Parton died. And around the world, people who had never met her felt as though they'd lost someone. Why? That's the question we started with. Why Dolly? There have been bigger selling artists, more powerful people, wealthier people, people surrounded by even greater fame. But Dolly possessed something you can't manufacture: warmth. She could laugh at herself. She could sit beside somebody completely different and somehow make them comfortable. She could look ridiculous by conventional standards and somehow appear completely comfortable doing it. Dolly never asked the world to take the image seriously. She asked us to take the person underneath it seriously. And eventually, we did. Perhaps that's why Dolly belonged to so many different people. Country fans loved her. Pop audiences loved her. Rock musicians respected her. Songwriters revered her. Children received books with her name inside them. Families in Tennessee received help when their homes disappeared. And generations who weren't even alive when Dolly recorded some of her greatest songs still knew exactly who she was. That's more than celebrity. That's legacy. And perhaps there's one final irony in Dolly Parton's story. The woman famous for looking artificial may have become beloved because she felt so remarkably genuine. The wigs were fake. The nails were fake. The rhinestones were extravagant. Dolly happily admitted that creating Dolly Parton required a little construction, but underneath all of it, the important things never seemed fake. The love for where she'd come from, the gratitude, the humor, the songwriting, the ambition, the generosity, the love for Carl. Those things were real, and maybe that's what people recognized. Dolly Parton spent 80 years creating an image the world could never forget, but somehow she made us care about the woman underneath it. So go back one last time to that little cabin. Imagine Dolly as a child standing outside with a homemade microphone, singing to an audience that didn't exist yet. She couldn't have known where those songs would take her. She couldn't have imagined that one day millions of people would know her name, that one of her songs would become one of the most famous love songs ever recorded, that she'd build an empire back in those same mountains, that children on the other side of the world would receive books because of something her father never had, that 80 years later, when Dolly Parton finally left us, the whole world would stop and remember. But perhaps if we could tell that little girl everything that was coming, she'd smile. Maybe she'd laugh. Maybe she'd fix her hair, pick up that homemade microphone, and keep singing. Because Dolly Parton didn't spend her life trying to escape where she came from. She spent it showing us how far someone could go without forgetting the way home. Asterisk, asterisk. She came from almost nothing. She built almost everything. And then, piece by piece, song by song, book by book, person by person, Dolly Parton spent the rest of her life giving away asterisk, asterisk. And maybe that's why the world loved her, because Dolly Parton didn't just leave us everything she'd made. She left us everything she gave, asterisk,